50 miles north of New York City, on a tiny, rocky island in the middle of the Hudson River, stands a crumbling fortress that looks like it was plucked straight from the Scottish Highlands and dropped into American waters. This is Bannerman Castle, and its story reveals something profound about wealth, ambition, and why the super-rich stopped building monuments like this over a century ago. The castle isn't actually a castle at all. It's an ammunition warehouse built by a Scottish immigrant who became the world's largest arms dealer. But to understand why this magnificent ruin matters, we need to go back to 1851, when a baby named Francis Bannerman was born in Dundee, Scotland. Frank Bannerman, as he preferred to be called before he fancied up his name to Francis, came to America at age 3 with his family. They settled in Brooklyn, where young Frank quickly proved he had an eye for opportunity. While other boys played in the streets, 12-year-old Frank scoured the Brooklyn harbor for scrap metal. He'd collect worn rope, rusty chains, anything of value that others discarded. Then he'd sell it. This wasn't just childhood entrepreneurship. Frank was helping his family survive. When the Civil War broke out and his father left to fight, Frank quit school entirely. He took on multiple jobs to support his mother and siblings, all while continuing his scrap business. The war that tore America apart became Frank's first real business opportunity. As the nation's bloodiest conflict wound down in 1865, the federal government suddenly had mountains of military equipment it no longer needed. Rifles, cannons, uniforms, tents, everything an army requires and no longer wants. Frank was only 14 years old when he founded his company. Most teenagers were still in school. Frank Bannerman was buying surplus Civil War equipment at government auctions and reselling it for profit. He essentially invented what would later be called the Army-Navy store, though on a scale that dwarfed anything that would come after. His timing was perfect. America in the late 1800s was entering a period of unprecedented military expansion and conflict. The Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, smaller conflicts and skirmishes, all produced surplus weapons and equipment. And Frank Bannerman was there to buy it all. He purchased 90% of all the arms and equipment seized by the United States after the Spanish-American War. When Sitting Bull was forced to surrender his tribe's weapons after the Battle of Little Bighorn, Bannerman bought all 50 rifles and carbines, some still loaded. When the battleship USS Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor in 1898, sparking the Spanish-American War, Bannerman bought the salvaged material. His business philosophy was simple but brilliant. Buy everything, no matter how obscure or damaged. Buy it for pennies on the dollar, then sell it to anyone who wanted it. Civilians walking in off the street could buy a Civil War rifle or a suit of medieval armor. Foreign armies and banana republics could outfit entire regiments. Municipalities could purchase small cannons for their town squares as monuments. To this day, if you see a French 75 artillery piece or a Civil War cannon under a flagpole in an American town square, there's a good chance it came from Bannerman by the late 1890s. Bannerman's business had grown so large, it occupied a 7-story building on Lower Broadway in Manhattan. The store was part museum, part military surplus paradise. You could wander through rooms filled with weapons from every conflict imaginable. Swords from the Napoleonic Wars, uniforms from the Crimean War, tomahawks, bayonets, machetes, pith helmets, complete suits of armor. A chain purportedly used at West Point during the Revolution. A table owned by George Washington. Equipment from Admiral Peary's North Pole expedition. Bannerman's 300-page annual catalogs became collectors' Bibles, referenced by historians and military enthusiasts for decades. The man had created an empire built on the detritus of war, and it was making him extraordinarily wealthy. But success created a problem. By 1900, Bannerman had so much ammunition stored in his Manhattan warehouses that New York City officials became concerned. The laws were clear. That much explosive material couldn't be stored within city limits. It was simply too dangerous. Bannerman needed to find a new location fast, somewhere outside the city where an explosion wouldn't level city blocks. The solution came from his son David, who was canoeing on the Hudson River one afternoon. About 50 miles north of Manhattan, David spotted a small rocky island rising from the water. It was called Polypel Island, though its name would soon change. The island had a strange history. Local Native Americans had considered it haunted and avoided it. During the Revolutionary War, patriots had tried to stop British ships by sinking iron-tipped logs around the island, hoping to damage enemy vessels. It hadn't worked, but for Bannerman's purposes, Polypel Island was perfect. It was uninhabited, isolated, surrounded by water, and just far enough from shore that an explosion wouldn't threaten nearby communities. In 1900, Bannerman purchased the island from the Taft family, and then he began to build his castle. Here's where the story gets fascinating. Frank Bannerman had traveled extensively through Europe on buying trips, visiting castles in Scotland, England, Germany, France, and Italy. He'd fallen in love with these stone fortresses. Like many immigrants who'd made fortunes in America, Bannerman felt a deep connection to the old country and wanted to recreate something of that world in his new homeland. The castle he designed was an architectural hodgepodge, a folk art fantasy that borrowed elements from castles he'd admired across Europe, a battlement from Bavaria, an embrasure from Scotland, a decorative pediment from Italy, all mixed together in a design that would have made Walt Disney smile. It wasn't historically accurate or architecturally pure. It was Bannerman's dream castle, built exactly how he wanted it. Construction began in 1901. But unlike the castles of Europe, which were built by master stonemasons over decades, Bannerman's castle was constructed by local farmers and workmen. No professional architects, no engineers, no contractors, just Bannerman's sketches and the workers' interpretations of those sketches. The construction materials weren't cut stone, but poured concrete and brick, frosted with cement to give the appearance of ancient stonework. The main arsenal building rose from the rocky island like something from a fairy tale. Towers, battlements, turrets, narrow windows that looked like arrow slits. The words Bannerman's Island Arsenal were cast in large letters on the side facing the river, visible to passengers on passing excursion boats and trains. The castle wasn't just a warehouse. It was a giant three-dimensional advertisement, a billboard you could see for miles. Bannerman also built a smaller residence on the highest point of the island for his family's summer use. His wife, Helen, who he'd met on a buying trip to Ireland decades earlier, turned the grounds into a garden paradise. She planted flowers and shrubs along the paths and terraces, creating pockets of beauty among the stone and ammunition. Some of those plants still grow wild on the island today. More than a century later, the Bannerman family spent summers on their island kingdom. While Frank decorated the residence with military relics from his collection, Helen tended her gardens. Their sons helped with the business, though one became a doctor instead. The island must have felt like a private world, a fortress where they could escape the noise of Manhattan and live surrounded by the trappings of old-world nobility. If you hit the like button on this video and subscribe to the channel, you'll be helping us create more stories about the fascinating, forgotten places that shaped American history. Now, let's talk about what happened next, because the story of Bannerman Castle is ultimately a story about impermanence. Frank Bannerman died in 1918 at age 68, worn out from decades of relentless work. The castle was never finished. Construction simply stopped when he died, leaving parts of the structure incomplete, which in a way makes it even more poignant. This was a man's dream project, and when he died, the dream died with him. His sons Francis VII and David continued operating the family business, but their focus shifted back to New York City. The island became less important to them. They forgot about their father's venture, leaving it to slowly deteriorate without proper maintenance. Then came 1920, just 2 years after Frank's death. On a summer day, more than 200 pounds of shells and powder exploded in the powder house. The blast was enormous. Windows shattered across the entire island. Towers crumbled. A 25-foot section of building was thrown over 1,000 feet of water, landing on the New York Central Railroad tracks and blocking the line for a day. The explosion could be felt in Poughkeepsie and Peekskill, miles away. According to family legend, Frank's widow, Helen, was relaxing in a hammock in front of the main house when the blast occurred. She'd just gone inside for a glass of iced tea moments before the explosion. That glass of tea may have saved her life. After the explosion, the Bannerman family largely abandoned the island. The business continued operating elsewhere, but the castle stood empty and neglected. In 1950, a squall sank the ferryboat Polypel, which had serviced the island. Without easy access, the island became even more isolated. By 1957, the property's last superintendent retired, and Polypel Island sat vacant for the next 3 decades. In 1967, the Bannerman family sold the castle to New York State. All the old military merchandise was removed and donated to the Smithsonian. The state had plans to open the island as a park, and even ran tours briefly in 1968. But on the night of August 8, 1969, disaster struck again. A fire of mysterious origin broke out and burned for 3 days and nights. By the time it was extinguished, all the building's interiors were destroyed. Roofs collapsed, floors burned away. Only the exterior stone walls remained standing, skeletal and haunted. After the fire, the state declared the island off-limits. For decades, Bannerman Castle sat abandoned, visible to train passengers on the Metro North Hudson line, but inaccessible to the public. The ruins became a Hudson Valley legend, this mysterious castle in the river that no one could visit. Stories accumulated. Some people thought it was a real medieval castle somehow transported to America. Others invented elaborate theories about its purpose. The castle continued to deteriorate. Weather and time took their toll. On the night of December 26, 2009, an estimated 35% of the front wall and east corner collapsed, the aging mortar finally giving way after decades of exposure to the elements. But here's where the story takes a turn toward redemption. In 1993, a man named Neil Kaplan from nearby Beacon became fascinated with the ruins. He founded the Bannerman Castle Trust, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving what remained and educating the public about the island's history. Kaplan started offering boat tours around the island twice a month. Eventually, he convinced New York State to allow hard hat tours where visitors could actually walk the island and explore the ruins up close. Today, tours run from May through November, departing from Beacon or Newburgh. For $40, adults can take a 30-minute boat ride to the island and explore its haunting beauty. The Trust has raised over $1 million for stabilization and preservation. They've planted new flowers in Helen Bannerman's old garden beds. They host movie nights, lectures, dinners, and theatrical performances in the shadow of the ruins. Bannerman Castle has become what it perhaps always was meant to be, a monument to ambition, impermanence, and the peculiar American drive to build something grand that announces to the world, I was here, I mattered, I achieved something worth remembering. Which brings us to the real question at the heart of this story. Why don't billionaires build castles anymore? Why did the Francis Bannermans of the world give way to tech billionaires buying sleek glass compounds and penthouse apartments? The answer reveals something fundamental about how wealth and power have changed in America over the past century. To understand it, we need to look at the era when Bannerman was building his castle, the period historians call the Gilded Age. From approximately 1870 to 1910, America underwent an industrial transformation unprecedented in human history. Railroads connected the continent, steel production exploded, oil fields gushed black gold, Telegraph lines and later telephone lines knitted the nation together. Manufacturing scaled up to levels previously unimaginable. This created a new class of super-wealthy individuals. The Vanderbilts in railroads, the Rockefellers in oil, the Carnegies and later J.P. Morgan in steel and finance, the Astors in real estate. These weren't people who'd inherited old money. They were self-made tycoons who'd accumulated wealth faster than anyone in history. And critically, there was no income tax, no capital gains tax, no estate tax. The federal government had virtually no way to claim a percentage of this wealth. Combined with minimal labor regulations and no real antitrust enforcement, these industrialists could accumulate and keep fortunes that would be impossible to amass today. But here's the interesting part. Despite having more money than the old money families of New York's social elite, these newly wealthy industrialists found themselves shut out of high society. The old Dutch and English families who'd been wealthy since colonial times looked down on the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers as nouveau riche, crude upstarts whose money was too new and whose methods were too ruthless. So the new millionaires and billionaires did what Frank Bannerman did. They built monuments to themselves. If society wouldn't accept them based on pedigree, they'd force acceptance through sheer architectural grandeur. The results were spectacular. In Newport, Rhode Island, summer cottages rose along the cliffs. The Breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had 70 rooms, imported Italian and African marble, and a dining room with a ceiling 50 feet high depicting the goddess Aurora. Marble House, built as a birthday present by William Vanderbilt for his wife Alva, featured a temple front portico compared to the White House itself. In Manhattan, Fifth Avenue became known as Millionaires' Row. The Vanderbilts alone built several massive mansions along this stretch, each trying to outdo the others. William K. Vanderbilt commissioned a French Renaissance and Gothic-style castle on the corner of 52nd Street in 1882. It had more rooms than anyone could count and cost millions. His brother Cornelius II built what became the city's largest single-family house, taking up an entire block. Andrew Carnegie ventured north on 5th Avenue to 91st Street, where he oversaw construction of a 64-room English Georgian mansion. It was the first American residence with a steel frame, and among the first with a private elevator and central heating. After his death, it became the Cooper Hewitt Museum. Down in North Carolina, George Vanderbilt II built Biltmore, a 250-room French Renaissance Revival chateau that remains the largest privately owned house in America. He filled it with art and rare books, creating what amounted to a private palace rivaling anything in Europe. These weren't just houses, they were statements. They announced to the world that American industrialists had arrived, that they could rival the aristocrats of Europe in culture and refinement, that their wealth commanded respect regardless of social pedigree. The architecture deliberately invoked European grandeur. Anything French or British was considered culturally superior, the gold standard these new Americans aspired to match. They imported stone from European quarries, furniture from French chateaux, entire rooms from dismantled castles and manor houses. They hired the finest architects of the age, men like Richard Morris Hunt and Stanford White, who'd trained in Paris and brought European sophistication to American ambitions. This is the context in which Frank Bannerman built his island castle. He wasn't part of the absolute top tier of wealth like the Vanderbilts or Rockefellers, but he was extraordinarily successful by any measure. And like them, he wanted to build something that connected him to the old world, something that said his success was worthy of the same respect as European nobility. His castle was smaller and stranger than the Newport mansions or Fifth Avenue palaces. It was a working warehouse that looked like a fantasy, but it represented the same impulse, this desire to create something permanent and grand that would outlast its creator, except nothing lasted. That's the thing about the Gilded Age mansions that we tend to forget when we tour the ones that survived. Most of them are gone. The Vanderbilt palaces on Fifth Avenue, demolished. The Astor Mansion, gone. Rows upon rows of limestone and marble that once lined Manhattan's most prestigious streets, torn down to make way for apartment buildings and commercial towers. By the 1920s and 30s, the era of these massive private mansions was already ending. Several factors combined to make them obsolete. First, taxes. The federal income tax, introduced in 1913, initially affected only the very wealthy, but gradually expanded. Estate taxes meant that passing these enormous properties to the next generation became prohibitively expensive. The wealth that built these mansions couldn't sustain them across generations once the government started taking its share. Second, labor costs. The Gilded Age mansions required armies of servants to function. 50, 100, sometimes 200 people were needed to staff the kitchens, tend the gardens, maintain the buildings, serve the family. As labor costs rose, and American culture shifted away from the servant class model, maintaining these properties became increasingly difficult and expensive. Third, changing tastes. The grandchildren of Gilded Age tycoons grew up in a different world. Many of them were educated, cultured, and somewhat embarrassed by the ostentatious displays of wealth their grandparents had created. The massive mansions felt excessive, even vulgar. Modernist architecture was rising in popularity, emphasizing clean lines, functionality, and a rejection of historical pastiche. Fourth, the Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 devastated even wealthy families. Suddenly, maintaining a 50-room mansion became not just impractical but impossible for many. Properties were abandoned, sold for pennies on the dollar, or simply left to decay. But the deepest reason the castle-building era ended goes beyond economics. It's about what castles represent. In medieval Europe, castles served two purposes. They were defensive fortifications that protected against military attack, and they were visible symbols of power and authority. A castle said, "I control this land, I have an army, I can defend what's mine." In a democratic society with rule of law, neither purpose makes sense anymore. Modern weapons made stone fortifications obsolete. Artillery and explosives could reduce years of castle construction to rubble in hours. And in America, political power wasn't supposed to come from private armies and fortified estates. It came from votes, laws, and economic influence. When someone today builds something that looks like a fortress, it raises questions. What are they defending against? Why do they need walls and battlements? The association with feudalism and authoritarian power makes people uncomfortable. It seems vaguely threatening, like the person is setting themselves up as a warlord rather than a citizen. Modern billionaires still build impressive houses, make no mistake, but their approach is completely different. They build for privacy, security, and wellness rather than display. Tech billionaires create compounds hidden behind trees and security systems, not visible monuments on main avenues. Their houses emphasize cutting-edge technology, sustainable design, and health amenities, hyperbaric chambers, red light therapy, infrared saunas, wellness lounges. When they do buy historic properties, it's often existing castles in Europe rather than building new ones. Middle Eastern royalty and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs purchase chateaux in France and castles in Britain as investments and retreats, but they frame it as preservation of heritage rather than personal aggrandizement. The emphasis has shifted from public grandeur to private comfort. A Gilded Age mansion was designed to be seen, to host elaborate parties and balls where hundreds of guests would marvel at the opulence. A modern billionaire's home is designed to be hidden, with the understanding that flaunting wealth is no longer socially acceptable or safe. This shift reflects a fundamental change in American culture. We're more democratic in our sensibilities now, even if wealth inequality has reached levels comparable to the Gilded Age. Public displays of extreme wealth are met with criticism rather than admiration. The Instagram aesthetics of modern luxury emphasize minimalism, sustainability, and understated elegance rather than gilt and marble excess. There's also a practical element. Modern life doesn't fit in castle architecture. We want open floor plans, natural light, seamless indoor-outdoor spaces, smart home technology, and comfortable living spaces. Medieval castle design, with its small windows, thick walls, and compartmentalized rooms, was optimized for defense. It makes for a terrible modern residence. And perhaps most importantly, today's billionaires are mobile in ways Gilded Age tycoons weren't. They own multiple properties around the world. They travel constantly. The idea of pouring resources into a single massive estate doesn't match their lifestyle. Why build one castle when you can own apartments in London, a villa in Tuscany, a beach house in the Hamptons, a ranch in Montana, and a penthouse in Manhattan? The few modern attempts to build castle-like properties illustrate the problem. In Turkey, developers created Burj Al Babas, a luxury development of 587 fantasy castles in a Gothic style, intended as holiday homes for wealthy tourists. The project became an infamous failure, leaving nearly 600 unfinished castle houses blighting a beautiful landscape in the Black Sea region. Turns out, even wealthy people don't actually want to live in mock castles. King Ludwig II of Bavaria learned this lesson the hard way in the 1800s when he spent millions building Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle that inspired Disney's logo. It was built as a medieval fantasy, but made mostly of brick with just a limestone facade. It had no real defensive qualities, and Ludwig never saw it completed. It was impractical, even by 19th century standards. So we're left with ruins and museums. Bannerman Castle stands in the Hudson River as a monument to an era when men like Frank Bannerman believed they could build permanence out of stone and concrete, when wealth felt solid and enduring, when creating a visible legacy seemed not just possible but necessary. The castle tells us something about the American dream and its limitations. Frank Bannerman came to this country as a child with nothing. Through hard work, opportunism, and relentless ambition, he built an empire. He wanted to crown that achievement with something beautiful and lasting, something that connected him to the land of his birth while celebrating his success in his adopted country. But permanence is an illusion. The castle exploded, it burned, it crumbled, nature and time reclaimed it. Just like the Fifth Avenue mansions that were demolished, just like the Newport cottages that became museums, just like the fortunes themselves that were taxed and divided and dissipated across generations. What remains is the story. Visitors who take the boat to Bannerman Island walk through ruins that feel genuinely ancient, even though they're barely over a century old. Helen Bannerman's flowers still bloom in the gardens she planted. The words Bannerman's Island Arsenal are still visible on the stone walls, advertising a business that ended decades ago. The Bannerman Castle Trust has done remarkable work preserving and stabilizing the ruins, ensuring that future generations can experience this peculiar piece of American history, but they're fighting a losing battle against entropy. Someday, probably not too far in the future, the remaining walls will collapse completely. The island will be just rocks and trees again, with perhaps some foundation stones visible among the undergrowth. This is the fate of all monuments eventually. The pyramids erode, the Roman Colosseum crumbles, medieval castles become picturesque ruins. What we build to last forever lasts only as long as someone cares enough to maintain it, and sometimes not even that long. Which brings us full circle to why billionaires stopped building castles. They learned what Frank Bannerman's castle teaches us. Permanence can't be bought. Legacy isn't built from stone. The things that actually last are ideas, stories, and the impacts we have on other people's lives. Modern billionaires increasingly focus on those things. Bill Gates works on global health through his foundation. Jeff Bezos invests in space exploration. Warren Buffett preaches about giving away wealth. They're trying to build legacies through actions and organizations rather than buildings. Whether those legacies will endure any better than Bannerman Castle remains to be seen. But standing on that rocky island in the Hudson, looking at walls that once protected mountains of ammunition and now protect nothing but memory, you understand something profound. We build castles because we're afraid of being forgotten. We stack stone and pour concrete because solid materials feel more permanent than the soft, ephemeral stuff of human life. Frank Bannerman is remembered not because his castle endures, but because it doesn't. The ruin is more powerful than the finished structure ever was. It's beautiful precisely because it's broken, meaningful precisely because it failed to achieve permanence. It reminds us that all our grand ambitions, all our wealth and achievement, all our attempts to leave a mark on the world, are temporary. The billionaires stopped building castles not because they lack the money or ambition, but because somewhere along the way we realized that castles are monuments to an illusion. They promise permanence, but deliver only maintenance costs and eventual decay. They announce power, but that power is already slipping away the moment construction begins. What we're left with are stories. Frank Bannerman, the Scottish immigrant who became the world's largest arms dealer, the island castle that was never finished, the explosions and fires, the decades of abandonment, the preservation efforts, the tourists who now visit and marvel at this strange American folly. These stories are the real monuments, more durable than stone, more flexible than concrete. They adapt and spread and evolve, carrying forward the essence of what Frank Bannerman was trying to say with his castle. That he existed, that he mattered, that he built something worth remembering. In the end, maybe that's all any of us can hope for, rich or poor, powerful or humble. Not permanence, which is impossible. Just to be remembered as we were, with our ambitions and failures, our dreams and limitations, our castles built on rocky islands that will someday return to the river. If you enjoyed this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe. There are countless stories like this waiting to be told, forgotten places, and remarkable people who shaped America in ways we're only beginning to understand. Thanks for watching.